Welcome to Pint-Sized History. In this episode, we will be going through the top 10 deadliest weapons in medieval history. Coming in at number 10, it's the flail. The flail is a type of medieval weapon that is often depicted in artwork, literature, and historical documents. It's a striking weapon that consists of a long handle or staff and a heavy metal ball at the end of a chain or a rope. The flail was a popular weapon during the Middle Ages, particularly in Eastern Europe and Russia, where it was used both by cavalry and infantry alike. The origin of the flail is still uncertain, but it is believed to have evolved from agricultural tools such as the threshing flail. The weapon was effective in battle because of its ability to strike opponents from a distance, making it difficult for them to defend themselves. The weight of the metal ball on the end of a chain or rope also increased the force of the blow, making the flail a formidable weapon in the hands of a skilled warrior. One of the main advantages of the flail was its versatility. It could be used to strike opponents from a distance, but it could also be used at close range, where the long handle or staff could be used to block incoming attacks. The flail was particularly effective against armoured opponents, as the metal ball could crush through armour and deliver a devastating blow to the wearer. The flail was also used by cavalry during medieval battles. Mounted knights would use flails to strike at enemy soldiers from horseback, adding momentum and speed to the already deadly weapon. The flail in particular was effective against infantry, as the mounted knights could use the weapon to reach over the shields of the foot soldiers and strike them with great force. Despite its effectiveness, the flail was not without its drawbacks. The weapon, for example, was difficult to master, and a novice could easily injure themselves or their allies with a poorly aimed swing. The long handle or staff also made the flail unwieldy in close quarters, where shorter weapons such as swords and axes might have been more effective. The use of the flail declined during the later Middle Ages, as advances in armour and weapons made it less effective on the battlefield. However, the weapon still continued to be used in Eastern Europe and Russia right up to the 16th century, where it was used by the Cossacks and other mounted warriors. At number 9, it's the halberd. The halberd was a medieval weapon that emerged primarily in the 14th century and was widely used until the 16th century. It was a versatile weapon that combined the features of a spear, an axe, and a hook. The halberd was typically about 6 feet long, with a long wooden shaft topped with a metal head that had a spear point, an axe blade, and a hook. Units in charge of a halberd, or halberdiers, were soldiers who used the weapon in battle to strike from a distance. The spear point was used to stab enemies, while the axe blade was used to deliver powerful chopping blows. The hook was used to pull enemies off of horses or to drag down shields, causing enemies to lose their balance. Halberds were often used as a weapon of the city guard. City guards were responsible for maintaining order in towns and cities, and the halberd was an effective weapon for this purpose. The long reach of the weapon allowed the guards to keep a distance from potential troublemakers, while the axe blade could be used to break down doors or barricades. The halberd was also used in tournament combat, where knights would joust against each other. The long reach of the halberd allowed knights to strike from far away, while the hook could be used to pull opponents off their horses. In some cases, the spear point was removed from the halberd to make it safer for tournament use. In addition to its weapon usage, the halberd was also a symbol of authority. In medieval times, halberdiers were often used as guards for nobles or other important individuals. The presence of a halberdier with a halberd signified the authority and the power of the person they were guarding. One notable example of the use of halberds in history is the Swiss Guard. The Swiss Guard was established in 1506 as a mercenary force to protect the Pope. The guards were armed with halberds and wore distinctive uniforms, which are still worn today. The Swiss Guard has a long and proud history of service, and their use of halberds is just one example of the weapon's enduring legacy. Coming in at number 8, it's the battle axe. The battle axe was an incredibly effective and devastating weapon during medieval times. It was a weapon of choice for many warriors and soldiers due to its ability to cause fatal wounds to opponents. The battle axe typically consisted of a heavy, sharp blade attached to a wooden handle, with its size and weight varying depending on its intended use. Its power and versatility made it a formidable weapon that could be used for both cutting and striking, with its weight allowing for powerful blows that could disable or kill an opponent. The axe was a favourite weapon of the Viking warriors, who were known for their skills in wielding the weapon. Viking battle axes were typically smaller and lighter than those used by other cultures, allowing for greater mobility and speed in combat. Despite its smaller size, however, there have been many reports of Viking warriors smashing through the helmets of their enemies, causing instantaneous death. Another example of the battle axe's devastating power can be seen through the Crusades. Muslim warriors were known to use battle axes in combat, and their use of the weapon was said to have inspired fear in their opponents due to the weapon's ability to penetrate armour and cause fatal injuries. Coming in at number 7, it's the lance. The lance was one of the most iconic weapons used in medieval times, particularly by knights on horseback. It was a long-poled weapon, typically made of wood and topped with a metal point, designed for use in jousting or in battle. The lance was a formidable weapon, both in terms of its size and its effectiveness. One of the reasons the lance was so effective in combat was its length. A typical lance was around 10 feet long, which allowed a knight to strike an opponent from a considerable distance. This was particularly useful in the chaos of battle, where a knight needed to be able to strike at his enemies without getting too close of them. Another reason the lance was so effective was its weight. A typical lance could weigh as much as 15 pounds, which gave it significant momentum when a knight charged at an opponent. This momentum, combined with the length of the lance, allowed the knight to strike with tremendous force, often knocking an opponent off his horse and shattering his armour. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of the effectiveness of the lance in medieval battles was the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Although the French army were defeated by the English, led by King Henry V, the French knights were not completely helpless. They too had lances, and they used them to deadly effect when they managed to get close to the English lines. In fact, it was the French lances that did most of the damage to the English, which is well documented. Another example of the effectiveness of the lance can be seen in the Battle of Hastings in 1066. During this battle, the Norman army, led by William the Conqueror, forced off against the English army, led by King Harold. The Normans were known for their skilled use of cavalry, and they deployed their knights on horseback to devastating effect. The Norman knights rode into battle with lances held firmly in their hands, and they used these weapons to break through the English shield wall. The English had formed a line of shields to protect themselves from the Norman charge, but the force of the Norman knights was too great. The lances penetrated the English shield wall, and the knights were able to break through and engage the English in close combat. The use of the lance in battle was instrumental in many victories throughout the ages. It allowed knights to charge into battle with tremendous force, breaking through shields and armour. The lance was a key factor in many conquests, and it remains an iconic weapon of medieval warfare to this day. Coming in at number 6, it's the Catapult. The Catapult was a siege engine that was used extensively throughout history to launch projectiles over long distances. Its earliest recorded use was by the ancient Greeks during the 4th century. The catapult was a devastating weapon that could inflict damage on structures, fortifications, and personnel. The catapult was primarily used during siege warfare, in which it was a common occurrence throughout history. In a siege, an attacking army would surround a city fortress and try to breach its defences. The catapult was an effective weapon in this type of warfare because it could launch projectiles over the walls of a city or fortress, causing damage to buildings and structures, and injuring or killing the defenders. The most common projectile used in the catapult was a large rock or stone, although other materials such as fire, diseased animals, or even human heads were sometimes used. The stones used in the catapult were often large enough to cause significant damage upon impact, and the momentum of the projectile could cause even more damage upon contact with the building or structure. One of the most famous uses of the catapult was during the siege of Constantinople in 1453. The Ottoman Empire, under the leadership of Sultan Mehmed II, had been attempting to capture the city for several weeks, but the defenders were holding out. Mehmed II decided to use a massive catapult known as the Basilica to breach the walls of the city. The Basilica was capable of launching stones weighing over 600 pounds, and it was aimed at the city's main gate. The attack was devastating. The impact of the stones caused the gate to collapse, and the Ottoman troops poured into the city. The defenders fought valiantly, but they were ultimately overwhelmed, and the city fell to the Ottoman Empire. At number 5, it's the Warhammer. The Warhammer was a devastating weapon, primarily used during the 14th and 15th century. This weapon was designed to pierce and crush armour, making it an excellent choice for knights and other soldiers who fought on horseback. Its popularity during the medieval era can be attributed to the emergence of plate armour, which was becoming resistant to swords and other traditional weapons. The Warhammer was a simple yet deadly weapon. It consisted of a wooden handle, usually around 2 feet long, and a metal head that weighed between 2 and 4 pounds. The head was typically made of steel, with one side shaped like a hammer and the other side pointed like a spike. The hammer side was used to bludgeon and dent armour, while the spike was used to pierce it. One of the Warhammer's most significant advantages was its versatility. It could be used against both mounted and foot soldiers, making it a popular choice for all types of warriors. The Warhammer was also a preferred weapon among knights, as it could be used effectively from horseback, A charging knight, for example, with a warhammer, could easily break through an opponent's shield and armour, leaving them defenceless. In fact, some warhammers were designed specifically for use on horseback, with longer handles and heavier heads to provide greater force and reach. Another advantage of the warhammer was its simple ease of use. Unlike swords and other weapons, for example, that required years of training and finesse to use effectively, the warhammer could be wielded by almost anyone with enough strength and determination. It required minimal training and could be devastating even in the hands of an unskilled warrior. Overall, the warhammer was a highly effective and devastating weapon. Its ability to pierce and crush armour, versatility in use, and ease of use made it a popular choice among knights and soldiers alike. And despite its simplicity, the warhammer definitely played a significant role in shaping the course of medieval warfare. At number 4, it's the sword. The sword has to be one of the most iconic and recognisable weapons of medieval times. For centuries, it was the weapon of choice for knights and warriors across Europe. The evolution of the sword, from its earliest origins to its final form in the medieval era, was a long and fascinating process that shaped the course of history. The earliest swords were simple and rudimentary. They were made of bronze or copper and were often short and straight. These swords were primarily used for stabbing and thrusting rather than slashing, as their blades were not sharp enough to cut through metal armour. Over time, swords evolved to become longer and more sophisticated. Iron and steel replaced bronze and copper as the primary materials, and blades became much longer, wider, and sharper overall. This allowed warriors to use swords not just for stabbing, but also for slashing and eventually cutting through armour. By the medieval era, swords had reached their peak form. The two primary types of swords were the arming sword and the long sword. The arming sword was a one-handed sword with a straight blade, and this was mostly used for close combat. The long sword was a two-handed sword with a slightly curved blade, and it was used for both close and long-ranged combat. The use of the sword in medieval times was widespread and varied. It was used by knights, foot soldiers, and mercenaries alike. It was also used in many different types of combat, from one-on-one duels right up to large-scale battles. It could be used in many different situations, from close to ranged combat. It was also very easy to carry and wield, making it a popular choice for foot soldiers and knights. The sword also played a significant role in shaping medieval society, as it was seen as a symbol of status and power, and many knights and lords carried ornate swords to demonstrate their wealth and influence. In fact, the quality of a knight's sword often determined their rank and status within society. Medieval swords in particular were versatile and deadly weapons that could inflict a wide variety of injuries on their targets. Depending on the type of sword and force of the blow, a sword strike could cause a range of injuries, from minor cuts and bruises to severe wounds that could prove fatal. One of the most common injuries caused by swords was cuts. A sword's sharp blade could easily slice through flesh, causing deep cuts that could bleed profusely. Even glancing blows could cause painful lacerations that could make it difficult to continue fighting. These cuts could occur anywhere on the body, from the head to the neck, right up to the limbs and torso. Another common injury caused by swords was puncture wounds. The pointed tip of a sword could penetrate deep into the body, causing internal injuries that could be difficult to diagnose or treat. A thrust to the chest or abdomen, for example, could cause severe damage to internal organs, while a thrust to the leg or the arm could damage muscles, tendons, and bones. Swords could also cause blunt force trauma. A heavy blow from a flat of a sword blade could cause a bruise or a fracture, breaking bones, or could even knock a person unconscious, or even cause brain damage. A skilled swordsman could use the hilt or the pommel of the sword to deliver powerful strikes that could stun or incapacitate an opponent. Most devastatingly, a sword could cause dismemberment. A well-placed blow could sever limbs or even decapitate an opponent, causing immediate death or severe injury. This was a gruesome but effective way to disable an opponent and end a fight quickly. Medieval swords, as mentioned, were capable of inflicting a wide range of injuries, from minor cuts and bruises to severe wounds that could prove fatal. Cuts, puncture wounds, blunt force trauma, and dismemberment were all possible outcomes of a sword strike, making it a versatile and deadly weapon that demanded respect and caution from those who wielded it. Coming in at number 3, it's the pike. The pike was a formidable weapon used in medieval warfare. It was a long spear-like weapon that could reach up to 18 feet in length, making it a highly effective tool for attacking enemies from a safe distance. The pike was particularly popular in the 14th and 15th centuries and was used extensively in battles throughout Europe. One of the most significant advantages of the pike was its range. Because it was so long, it allowed soldiers to keep their enemies at a safe distance. This meant that soldiers using the pike could remain relatively safe from harm while still inflicting damage on their opponents. The pike was especially effective when used in formation with other pikemen, as they could form a wall of spears that was nearly impossible for enemy cavalry to penetrate. The pike was also a devastating weapon when used to charge an enemy line. Because of its length and weight, a pike charge could crush through an enemy's formation, breaking their ranks and causing chaos and panic. This was particularly effective against most cavalry charges, as the pikes could be angled downwards to impale the horses, causing them to throw their riders and creating even more carnage and chaos in the battlefield. Another advantage of the pike was the fact that it was relatively cheap and easy to produce. Unlike other weapons, such as swords or crossbows, which required skilled craftsmen to produce, pikes could be made quickly and inexpensively. This meant that armies could equip large numbers of soldiers with pikes, making them an effective tool for both offense and defense. Despite its effectiveness, the pike had some disadvantages. One of the main drawbacks was its weight and size. Because it was so long, it was difficult to maneuver in close combat, and pikemen were vulnerable to attacks from flanking or rear positions. Additionally, the pike was not very effective against heavily armoured opponents, as the armour could deflect the thrusts of the spear. Despite its drawbacks, however, the pike remained a popular weapon throughout the medieval period and played a significant role in many battles and wars. At number 2, it's the crossbow. The crossbow was a revolutionary weapon that had a significant impact on medieval warfare. It was a powerful, ranged weapon that could penetrate armour and had the potential to take down even the most heavily armoured knights. It was particularly popular in the 12th and 13th centuries and was used extensively in battles throughout Europe. One of the main advantages of the crossbow was its power. It was a highly accurate weapon that could be fired from a distance of up to 300 meters, allowing soldiers to strike their enemies from a safe range. Because of its power, it could be used to penetrate armour and shields alike, making it an effective tool against heavily armoured opponents. Another advantage of the crossbow was the fact that it was relatively easy to use. Unlike the longbow, for example, which required years of training to master, the crossbow could be used effectively by soldiers with little or no training. This made it an effective tool for arming large numbers of soldiers quickly. It could be used in a variety of roles, including as a defensive weapon, a weapon for siege warfare, and sometimes as a hunting weapon. It could also be modified to shoot different types of bolts, including armor-piercing, barbed, and in rare cases, explosive bolts. Despite its many advantages, however, the crossbow had some disadvantages. One of the main drawbacks was its slow rate of fire. It took longer to reload a crossbow than it did an ordinary bow, making it less effective in battles where quick firing was essential. Additionally, the crossbow was heavier than the longbow, which made it more difficult to carry and use in battle. One more disadvantage was the fact that the crossbow was quite expensive to produce. Unlike weapons such as the pike, which we discussed earlier, which could be made quickly and inexpensively, the crossbow required skilled craftsmen to produce and repair. This meant that armies could only arm a small number of soldiers with crossbows at any given time, limiting their overall effectiveness on the battlefield. Despite its disadvantages, the crossbow was a powerful and versatile weapon that had a significant impact on medieval warfare. Its power, accuracy, and ability to penetrate armour made it a very formidable tool for both offensive and defensive roles. Finally, at number 1, and in our opinion, the most devastating weapon in medieval history, it's the longbow. The longbow was one of the most important weapons in medieval history. Its use spanned several centuries, and it was a primary weapon for English and Welsh armies from the 12th right up to the 16th century. The longbow was a key factor in some of the most significant battles in the medieval period. It evolved from the short bow, which had been used in England since pre-Roman times. The longbow was obviously longer than the short bow, but measured over 6 feet in length and had a much greater draw weight, which allowed it to shoot arrows with greater velocity and accuracy. The longbow was typically made of yew wood, which was quite durable and flexible. One of the most significant advantages of the longbow was, as mentioned, its range and accuracy. Skilled longbowmen, for example, could hit targets of distances up to 250 meters, which was slightly shorter than the crossbow. However, they were still deadly over long distances. Additionally, the longbow could also pierce armour, like the crossbow, making it also an effective weapon against heavily armoured opponents. The longbow was responsible for causing some of the most gruesome injuries in medieval warfare. Arrows fired by the longbow could penetrate armour and inflict serious wounds. At the Battle of Agincourt, which we mentioned earlier also, English longbowmen were able to inflict significant casualties on the French army, many of whom were killed or wounded by arrows that penetrated their armour. The longbow required a great deal of training to use effectively. Archers had to spend years practicing their craft in order to become skilled longbowmen, and this training was often expensive and time-consuming. Nevertheless, the longbow remained a popular weapon throughout the medieval period. Probably one of the most famous examples of the effectiveness of the longbow was at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. English longbowmen were able to repel a much larger French army by firing a barrage of arrows that completely decimated the French. The Battle of Agincourt, which we've already mentioned several times now, was fought almost 70 years after the Battle of Crécy. And in this battle, there were also similarities in which the English used their longbows once again, great effect, causing multiple casualties on a separate French army. This, in essence, is what brings the longbow to our number one spot. Due to the sheer speed at which archers could loose arrows, a hail of death would literally rain down on units, causing untold casualties and murder in constant succession, never letting up, and cutting anyone down who got in the way. And that brings us to the end of our top 10 list of the most deadliest weapons in medieval history. What did you think? Did we leave anything out? Do you agree or disagree with our rankings? Let us know in the comments below. Also, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, as this really helps the channel out and encourages us to produce more videos. Until next time.